Chapter 3. The senior picnic was held on the following Wednesday. A gray, chilly day threatening rain. Classes were suspended for all those who had made it to graduation without collecting more F's than B's. They traveled by car to the beautiful stretch of parkland north of Toomey, known as Peninsula Point. Aptly named, the park was located in the very center of a long, narrow strip of land stretching toward the ocean like a pointing finger. While the peninsula's middle was lush with greenery, the tip itself was barren. The only color provided by the golden beige of wind-blown sand dunes and the white stone of an old, abandoned lighthouse. A white metal sign on a rusted metal chain in front of the entrance to the lighthouse swung gently in the ever-brisk ocean breeze, spelling danger and warning visitors against entering the aging structure. Many people ignored the sign. To some, the word danger acted as a red flag, enticing them to climb over the chain and push open the rickety old door whose lock had been useless for years. To others, the thought of the awe-inspiring view from the circular wooden platform at the top of the structure, just beneath the light itself, drew them onward and upward, heedless of the risk. The floor and wooden railing encircling the observation deck might be rotting and crumbling, but the spectacular view of the endless ocean remained intact. Nature lovers who made the precarious climb up the rusted, metal spiral stairs that trembled beneath their weight felt the view was worth both the climb and the risk. The small white metal sign continued to flap uselessly in the breeze, as if to say, "Well, I tried my best. It's not my fault if they all ignore me." Margaret loved the lighthouse. She'd been making the shaky climb to the top since she was a child, Adrian's stern warnings going unheeded. Few things were as thrilling to Margaret as reaching the top, breathless, knees trembling from the climb, emerging through the small, weather-beaten door to the deck to step outside and face the broad, endless stretch of ocean and sky. She didn't mind the wind slamming into her like a cannonball, and she loved the taste of salt water on her lips. Sometimes the water was gray-green, sometimes gray-blue. On cold, wind-whipped days, it was always gray-white, the whitecaps taller than Margaret. It was like that on the day of the picnic, the ocean raging gray-white, every last trace of blue or green gone from the water, blanketed by a sooty gray sky overhead. Still upset over the vandalism at the store and tired of playing softball and volleyball, Margaret left the festivities and trudged up toward the point alone. No use asking Caroline or the others to come along. Jeanine and Lacey were afraid of the lighthouse, and Caroline hated it, calling it a creepy old relic that should have been torn down a long time ago. Margaret knew she was just quoting her mother. Cecilia LaSalle, a close friend of Adrian's, had no interest in the past and called antiques junk. She called the lighthouse an eyesore to our community and a death trap. Margaret had never thought of the lighthouse as a death trap. The only person who had ever died at the lighthouse, as far as Margaret knew, was old Sud's Crater, who was ancient himself and drank so much that people in town joked that he'd actually died a long time ago. But the alcohol in his system had preserved him for all eternity. He had fallen from the observation deck on a warm, balmy night in October. The fall had literally scared him to death. Margaret had heard. His heart had stopped on the way down. When she finally reached the top of the lighthouse stairs, Margaret moved to the edge of the circular walkway, avoiding broken floorboards. The wind ripped her sweatshirt hood off her head and stung her eyes. Careful not to lean against the white wooden, waist-high railing, she thrust her hands into the pockets of her bright blue sweatshirt. The sound of the breakers crashing into the rocks below thundered around her, as if a storm were imminent. She loved that sound, but it was so loud that when a voice behind her said, "Awesome, right?" she almost didn't hear it. She turned to find a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a red sweatshirt standing slightly behind her on her left. Because he was wearing his hood, it took her a few seconds to place him. Then a gust of wind caught the hood and flung it backwards, setting free thick, dark hair. Mitch McGill, Lisa Buffet's sometime boyfriend. Hard to figure why one of the cutest guys at Toomey would put up with an on-again, off-again relationship. And he must be nice, too, because he was always getting elected to things. What did he see in Liza? Oh, come on, Margaret. Beauty, brains, popularity, for starters. And Lisa wasn't mean like Stephanie. All of the pops couldn't be mean, or they wouldn't be popular, would they? Mitch moved up to stand beside Margaret. Sort of gives you a chill, doesn't it? He asked loudly over the pounding of the surf. And I'm not talking about the weather. Margaret's tongue had had a stroke. It was completely paralyzed. She was so conscious of how close he was, she could only nod silently. But she did turn her head to glance over at him. A great face, all strong bones and angles, and his eyes were a warm, spaniel brown. He wasn't smiling, but he looked as if he might have just finished smiling or was about to do so again. She'd seen that face smiling at school when he didn't know she was watching. It was awesome. Then he shocked her out of her sudden muteness by turning toward her to give her a long look before asking, "Aren't you, Margaret, done? Is everything okay now at Quartet? I heard you had some trouble over there." Margaret's jaw fell open, but she couldn't be sure if she was surprised because he knew about the vandalism at the store, or because he knew who she was. "No one is supposed to know about that," she said, tasting salt spray as she spoke. "My mother was hopping no one would hear about it." "Oh, sorry. My brother Eddie was one of the cops that night. He felt really bad, said your mom seemed scared." "She wasn't scared," Margaret responded a bit sharply. "My mother's not afraid of anything. She was upset, that's all. Who wouldn't have been?" He held up a defensive hand. "Hey, take it easy. I wasn't insulting her. Eddie just felt bad for her, that's all." Had she heard the officer say his name was McGill? Margaret didn't think so. If she had, she might have paid more attention to him. It made all of us sick that the dresses were ruined. My mother worked really hard on them, and the prom isn't that far away now. doesn't give her a whole lot of time to replace them. She couldn't believe she'd mentioned the prom. If he asked her who her date was, she'd have to utter the dreaded words, "I don't have a date." Well, so what? It was the truth, after all. So if he asked her, she would tell he truth, and she wouldn't lower her eyes or turn her face away. She'd just say it, straight out. But he didn't ask. Instead, he leaned his elbows on the railing and to Margaret's surprise said, "Me, I'm skipping the prom this go-round." The railing's flacking white paint clung to the sleeves of his red sweatshirt. The old wallet's anorexic, flat as a pancake, or flat as a dress run over by the tires of a car, Margaret thought darkly. Why had he reminded her of what had happened at Quartet? She'd been trying not to think about it, or about what it might mean. She said nothing aloud. He wasn't going. One of the most popular guys in school wasn't going to his senior prom. He wasn't taking Lisa, but she'd bought a dress. Never mind that the dress was, literally, roadkill now. There would be a replacement in time. Adrian would see to that. Had Lisa snubbed Mitch for a college guy? Or delicious thought, maybe he hadn't asked Lisa. After all, she could afford to foot the bill if he really wanted to go with her. Was he one of those stiff-necked guys who insisted on paying his own way? Whatever the reason, Mitch McGill wasn't going to be escorting Lisa and her sexy black dress to Toomey's prom. The sun suddenly seemed to be shining, although, when Margaret glanced up, the sky was that same solid slate gray. It hadn't changed. So why did she suddenly feel much warmer? Might as well spit it right out. Margaret told herself and said, "You're not taking Lisa." Lisa? Nope. Went with Lisa last year. His voice was noncommittal. "I heard she's going with some college friend of her brother Brandon." Still no inflection in his voice. He'd heard. He hadn't talked to Lisa lately. More good news. She couldn't help wishing that something in his voice would tell her if he cared that Lisa was going with someone else. But it didn't. "You shouldn't lean on that railing," she warned. "It's too shaky. I don't want to have to climb around on those rocks down there picking up the pieces if that railing crumbles and takes you down with it." Nodding agreement, he took a step backwards. "So, is the store okay now? Haven't had any more break-ins, have you?" No, she wouldn't have minded talking about the incident with him. It would have been nice to bounce all of her questions off someone who could be objective. Adrian refused to discuss it, insisting that it had just been a prank, and the police would handle it. Caroline had been so frightened by the whole thing that her face went gray if Margaret even mentioned it. And the only thing Scott had on his mind these days was how to persuade Caroline to invite him to the prom. Even if the juvenile prank theory had made sense to Margaret, which it didn't, it wouldn't explain the deep, dark chill she felt when she remembered kneeling on that cold, damp cement, holding the remains of those dresses in her hands. She had many, many questions about the ugly incident and needed to talk them over with someone. But she couldn't talk to Mitch about it. Adrian would be very upset if she knew Margaret was discussing the incident with anyone other than Caroline or Scott, who already knew. The wind attacked them with a gust so fierce it took Margaret's breath away. "Everything's fine at quartet," she said. "I need to go back now. I've been gone a long time, and I'm getting cold." "Right, me too." She hadn't expected him to come with her, but she couldn't help thinking how neat it would be if he walked all the way back to the picnic with her, and they showed up at the park together. Caroline would freak. Unfortunately, the Pops would probably freak too. The Pops freaking would not be a good thing. Making up her mind to stay slightly ahead of Mitch when they arrived at the park, Margaret started down the circular metal staircase, stepping carefully and avoiding the rotting railing. They descended then, their sneakers making gentle slapping sounds on the steps. They passed no one. Margaret wondered how Mitch had known who she was. She wasn't wearing her quartet pin, a small, silver piece made by joining together 4 tiny musical instruments: a violin, a clarinet, a viola, and an oboe. A friend of Adrian's had designed them. She ordered hundreds of them to give away as souvenirs to customers. They sat in a wicker basket near the register. Anyone could take one, but Margaret wasn't wearing hers. Not that it would have told him much. It wasn't as if the pins spelled out her name. Tons of teenagers in Toomey owned one of those pins. But he'd said, "Aren't you Margaret Dunn?" How had he known that? Maybe Lisa had pointed her out, mentioned that her mother ran quartet. Any other time, Margaret would simply have asked. That was the way she was. If a question was on her mind, she would blurt it out, fully expecting an answer. Sometimes that tactic got her into trouble, but so far, that hadn't stopped her. But this felt different. Although her tongue had fully recovered, she couldn't quite make it ask. "How did you know who I was?" She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she was afraid he would say, "Lisa told me." She'd hate that. Yuck. They were outside, and on their way up the dirt road toward the park when he answered the question for her. "Eddie was right," he said casually. "Eddie, your brother the cop. Right about what?" He said the woman who owns Quartet is gorgeous. Margaret nodded. It no longer pained her that she looked more like the pictures of her father than she did Adrian. For years, she had just assumed that when she was old enough, she would look exactly like her mother. They had the same coloring. But the summer she was 13, she had suddenly spurted up to her full growth and grown into her adult face. Then the truth was inescapable. She had inherited her mother's eyes. But that was all. She'd been furious that whole summer and for most of the following school year. She couldn't remember now exactly when it had stopped making her mad. One day she had told herself that if she looked exactly like her mother, she might meet someone like her father. Then he might want to marry her, and she might say okay. Then, one day when she thought everything was great, he'd get drunk, because although he was cute and charming and tons of fun, he had never really grown up. He would try to race a train at a crossing, a really juvenile thing to do, and he'd lose. Then, like her mother, she'd be left alone, without any money, to raise any children they'd had. The dismal, imagined scenario had gone a long way toward helping her be grateful for who she really was. not to mention appreciating who her mother was and what she'd been through. She is gorgeous. You've seen her. Nope, never. Puzzled, she glanced up at him. Then, how do you know your brother was right about what she looks like? Without returning her glance, he said very casually. The second thing my brother said was that her daughter had the prettiest eyes he'd ever seen, including his wife Becky's. So, I figure, since I can see for myself that he was right about that, I know he had to be right about your mom being gorgeous, too. I'd like to meet her sometime. Caught off guard by the roundabout way in which he'd told her she had nice eyes, Margaret could only ask lightly, "Because she's gorgeous?" He laughed. "No, because Eddie said she was really nice." Although the prom was still more than 2 weeks away, Margaret felt like dancing right there on the dusty, rutted road. He wasn't going to the prom. Not with Lisa, not with anyone. And he had said she had nice eyes. And he was keeping up with her, stride for stride, so that pops or no pops, they were definitely going to be walking onto the picnic grounds together. He's just being nice, she thought to herself. His brother told him about the demise of the dresses, and he thought it was rotten, that's all. Don't go making this into something it isn't, Margaret Dunn. That's just not like you. She tried. She really did. But he was so nice, bending his head against the wind to ask her about the shop and her family, and what she liked to do when she wasn't working at the store, and had she played softball all of her life because he'd been watching her play, and was impressed with the way she hit the ball every single time, whacked it right out of the park almost, and had she ever thought of playing in a summer league, because he was going too, and they could always use new players. It almost undid her when he talked about summer, as if there were no reason on earth why, come summer, they wouldn't still be walking like this and talking like this, and even playing on the same softball team. She was about to respond with something truly inane like, "I just adore softball," something Margaret Dunn would never, ever have said if she'd been in her right mind when they heard the scream.